Good morning. I want you to picture this. You have just moved into a new city for a job. Your apartment is full of half unpacked boxes. You don't know a single person within 500 miles, and the loneliness is starting to settle in like a very heavy, depressing fog. Now, you're in a classical transition state, physically displaced, emotionally drained, and desperately craving a sense of community. Now, in a few weeks after this happens, a few weeks in, a charismatic coworker notices you eating lunch alone. They're incredibly warm, sharply dressed, and they radiate a kind of effortless confidence. They mention a weekend wellness and networking seminar that they attend. They tell you it's full of ambitious, like minded people, and they offer to pay for your guest pass. You have nothing else to do on Saturday, so you say yes. When you walk through the doors of the conference center, the energy is intoxicating. Everyone is smiling. People you have never met are just walking up, shaking your hand, and asking you deep, probing questions about your dreams and your fears. And more importantly, they're actually listening. And for the first time in months, you feel entirely seen, validated, and important. Now, the weekend concludes with a keynote speech from the founder of the organization, a dynamic, magnetic speaker who seems to articulate your exact internal struggles. And when you leave on Sunday night, you feel like you have finally found your tribe. Over the next few months, the group becomes your entire social life. They're always there for you, but they also start asking for more of your time. They suggest you stop calling your friends back home, subtly hinting that those people are toxic and they're holding you back from your true potential. And when the organization asks for a larger financial commitment for advanced training, you hesitate. But your new friends remind you of how much you have grown and how much this investment will unlock your ultimate success. So you drain your savings account, and when your family expresses concern, the group tells you that this is exactly what the unenlightened world does to try and drag you down. Now, fast forward 3 years, you're sitting in a crowded auditorium, completely estranged from your family. You're entirely broke and emotionally dependent on a leader who dictates what you eat, who you date, and how you think. Now, if you're listening to this right now, you're probably shaking your head and thinking, that's never going to happen to me. I'm far too smart, too rational, and too independent to ever fall for that. But that's the single most dangerous myth about cults. They don't recruit the stupid, they don't recruit the crazy, they recruit the vulnerable. They use a precise, heavily researched set of psychological tools designed to bypass your logic and hijack your deepest human needs. Today, we're going to look under the hood of human behavior and strip away the mystery and dissect the exact anatomy of a cult. So, I want to tackle a misconception right away here. I want to jump in and talk about the I am too smart to join a cult. Whenever we watch a documentary about a high control group or a doomsday cult, our brains immediately try to distance us from the victims. We look at the people on the screen and tell ourselves a comforting lie that they must have a personality defect or they must be weak minded. There's a specific type of person who joins a cult, and I'm not that guy. But psychologists who study coercive control will tell you that there is no universal cult personality. High control groups are filled with doctors, lawyers, Ivy League graduates, even incredibly cynical, street smart people. The truth is much more frightening. Cults don't recruit a specific type of person, they recruit people in a specific season of life. Now, in psychology, this season of life, we call this a transitional state. A transitional state happens when the basic architecture of your life is suddenly dismantled. Think about the massive pillars that hold up your identity, your family, your career, your romantic relationships, your geographic location, even your worldview. But when you go through a divorce, you lose a parent, you get fired from a job, or you move somewhere strange and get a new job, even when you just graduate from college and move to a new city, one of those massive pillars is knocked out from under you. And suddenly your environment is no longer as predictable. Now, when you're in this transitional state, your brain is in crisis mode. Your cognitive load is maxed out because you are constantly trying to figure out how to survive this new, unfamiliar reality. The resulting emotional cocktail is a potent mix of grief, exhaustion, and profound loneliness. And this is the exact environment where these cults thrive. To understand why transitional states are so dangerous, we have to look at the psychological concepts known as the need for cognitive closure. Human beings are biologically wired to dislike ambiguity. We hate gray areas. When we are stressed or grieving, our brains expend a massive amount of energy trying to find solid ground. We desperately want to find someone that'll hand us a map and point to X and say, this is exactly where you are, and this is exactly what you need to do next. This is why traditional self help, organized religion, and therapy are so popular during these transitional states, because they offer structure. But a cult takes this psychological need for closure and weaponizes it. While a wealthy organization will give you tools to navigate the gray areas of life, a cult promises to eliminate the gray areas entirely. They offer absolute black and white certainty. They tell the more vulnerable person, you don't have to figure this out anymore. We have the absolute truth. Just follow our rules, submit to our leader, and you will never have to feel lost or anxious or uncertain ever again. This is the perfect psychological storm. You have a person whose identity is fractured, who is physically or emotionally isolated, and whose brain is desperately craving an end to ambiguity. When the cult leader or when the cult recruiter spots someone in this state, they don't see a broken person, they see highly pliable clay. The recruit isn't looking for a cult, they're just looking for an anchor. And the tragedy is that the cult is more than happy to provide one, and right before they drop it to the bottom of the ocean and pull you down with it. Now that we understand the vulnerability of the recruit, we have to look at the predator. Who is the person holding the chain? Let's dive into the psychology of the cult leader and the dark triad. The dark triad, this is a concept. It is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And now that we understand the transitional state leaves a recruit searching for an anchor, we have to look at the person standing on the ship ready to throw it to them. Now, what makes a cult leader? When we look at history's most notorious cult leaders, from Jim Jones to the modern day wellness gurus and extreme online influencers, they all seem entirely different on the surface, but they underneath that ideology, psychologists have found that they almost always share an identical psychological blueprint. In psychology, this specific personality profile is known as the dark triad. It is the combination of three distinct malevolent personality traits that, when combined in one human being, creates the ultimate predator. Those three traits are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So let's break it down, starting with narcissism. In pop culture, we tend to overuse this word to describe anyone who takes too many selfies. But clinical narcissism is a lot darker. It's characterized by grandiosity, an extreme sense of entitlement, and a constant, insatiable need for admiration. In a cult leader, this manifests as the Messiah complex. The leader truly believes that they are uniquely special, that they are the only ones who speaks to God, the only one who understands the universe, and the only one who possesses the secret to financial freedom, because they view themselves as superior to the rest of humanity. The normal rules of society simply do not apply to them. And this is why you constantly see cult leaders living in absolute luxury or engaging in horrific abuses while forcing their followers to take vows of poverty or celibacy. Their narcissism convinces them that they deserve everything and that you only exist to worship them. Number two in this triad, Machiavellianism, the puppet master. The second trait, Machiavellianism, is named after the Renaissance political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. A highly Machiavellian person is a master of strategic manipulation and deceit. They possess a cold, calculating, the ends justify the means worldview. If narcissism is the desire to be worshipped, Machiavellianism provides the tools to make that happen. So, to a Machiavellian leader, The other human beings are not people, they're chess pieces. They are highly skilled at reading the room, identifying a person's deepest insecurities, and exploiting them for personal gain. This trait is why cult leaders are so good at boundary testing. A Machiavellian leader won't ask you to cut off your family on day one. Instead, they will strategically ask you to do something slightly uncomfortable, like work late on a Friday or publicly confess a minor sin. They watch how easily you yield, and once they know that you can be manipulated, they slowly and methodically tighten the strings. The final and most dangerous component in the dark triad is psychopathy. In this context, psychopathy is defined by high impulsivity, thrill seeking nature, and a complete, terrifying lack of empathy or remorse. When a normal person hurts someone, their brain generates guilt, and guilt acts as a psychological braking system that stops us from destroying each other. A psychopath has no braking system. They are physiologically incapable of feeling remorse. This is the trait that allows a cult leader to drain the follower's life savings, separate the mother from her children, or subject their members to sleep deprivation and then sleep perfectly and soundly that night. They simply don't care if you are destroyed in the process of building their empire. And when you put these three traits into a blender, the grandiosity of narcissism, the calculating manipulation of Machiavellianism, and the ruthless lack of empathy of a psychopath, you don't just get a bad boss or a toxic partner, you get a traumatic narcissist. You get a cult leader. And when this dark triad personality locks eyes with a vulnerable person in a transitional state, that trap is officially set. But how do they actually get the recruit to walk into the cage? They do it by deploying the most potential psychological weapon in their arsenal, love bombing. They don't ask you to give your life savings on day one. They ask you to do something slightly uncomfortable. When we hear stories about people handing over their life savings to some kind of a guru or leader or cutting off all contact with their families, our immediate reaction is, I wouldn't do that. If someone asked me to, I'd just walk out the door. And you're absolutely right. You would walk out the door, which is exactly why a Machiavellian cult leader will never ask you to do those things on day one. To understand how a highly intelligent person ends up in a cult, we have to look at the Machiavellian tactic of boundary testing. Cult leaders operate exactly like the metaphor of the boiling frog. If you drop a frog in boiling water, it jumps out immediately. But if you put it in lukewarm water and slowly turn up the heat, it will quietly boil to death. Cult leaders are masters of the thermostat. Boundary testing starts with incredibly small and seemingly harmless micro violations. The leader wants to see how pliable that your reality is. Now, let's say you join a new highly intense startup company or a tight knit fitness community. During your first week, the leader asks you to stay an hour late on Friday night just to help the team finish a project. It's a minor inconvenience, but you want to be a team player, so you agree. You just passed the first test. You prove that your boundaries are flexible when presented with group pressure. A few weeks later, the test will escalate. The leader asks you to publicly share a deeply personal, embarrassing childhood memory in front of the group as a trust building exercise. Now, if you hesitate, they don't yell at you. Instead, they will use a Machiavellian manipulation. Oh, I thought you were truly committed to growing with us. Are you letting your ego get in the way of your breakthrough? To avoid the sudden threat of rejection, you share the secret. You just passed the second test. You've proven that you will prioritize the group's approval over your own psychological safety. This is how grooming works. It is slow, methodical erosion of the word no. Every time you agree to a minor violation of your boundaries, you're quietly training your brain to submit to the leader's authority. The leader is strategically pushing the fence line of your comfort zone back, inch by inch, day by day. They ask you to change your diet, and then they ask you to stop listening to certain music, and then they suggest that your spouse is blocking your spiritual energy and that you should spend less time with them. because you have already said yes to 100 smaller demands. Saying yes to this massive demand doesn't feel like a radical leap. It feels like just the logical next step in your growth. By the time the leader finally asks for your life savings or demands that you sever all ties with the outside world, the water is already boiling. Your boundaries have already been pushed so far back that you can no longer even see where they originally stood. The Machiavellian leader hasn't just broken your boundaries, they've manipulated you into actively tearing them down yourself. And the most terrifying part of this process is that because it happened so slowly, you genuinely believe that giving up your autonomy was entirely your own idea. One of the most defining markers of a destructive cult is the absolute unquestionable infallibility of the leader. In a healthy organization, a leader can admit when they've made a mistake. They can apologize and they can pivot. But remember, a cult leader is driven by severe narcissism of the dark triad. Their fragile ego and massive messiah complex can't tolerate even the slightest hint of failure. So, to maintain their godlike status, they have to convince the group that they are literally incapable of being wrong. Their doctrines, their business strategies, and their prophecies are all framed as absolute universal truths. But we live in reality, and in reality, things go wrong. Prophecies fail, investments tank, and promised healings don't happen. So, what happens when the infallible leader makes a very visible mistake? Well, when the reality inevitably clashes with the leader's promises, the group experiences a massive psychological crisis. The leader can't take the blame because if they're wrong about this one thing, they might be wrong about everything. And the entire power structure starts to collapse. So, to protect the illusion of perfection, the leader must immediately deploy a scapegoat. The blame is always pushed violently downward onto its followers. Let's say a doomsday cult predicts the end of the world on a specific Tuesday. The members sell their homes, they quit their jobs, and they gather on a hill. Wednesday morning arrives, the sun comes up as usual. Man, the prophecy failed. But instead of apologizing, the leader pivots instantly. They tell the group, the world didn't end because some of you lacked faith. Someone here harbored secret doubts, and your negative energy blocked the prophecy. Or alternatively, they claim, well, because of my intense prayers, the universe granted us a second chance. This tactic is used constantly in everyday microcults as well. In a toxic multi-level marketing scheme, if you aren't making the massive profits the leader promised, it's never because the business model is a predatory scam. The leader will look at you and say, you just aren't working hard enough. You just don't want it badly enough. You have a poverty mindset. Now, if this leader promises that their exclusive diet will cure your depression and you're still depressed, they will tell you that you must have secretly eaten a carb or ruined the process. By weaponizing blame, the leader accomplishes two things. Simultaneously, first, they protect their own infallibility, and second, they drive the follower deeper into submission. The follower absorbs the massive guilt, believes the failure is entirely their own fault, and becomes even more desperate to work harder, pray harder, and submit more fully to win back the leader's approval. This creates an environment of absolute paranoia. Followers become terrified of being the weak link that brought down the wrath of the leader. They begin policing themselves and each other, constantly searching for hidden flaws. The tragic irony of the scapegoat tactic is that the very failures that should expose the leader as a fraud end up traumatizing the followers into becoming even more devout. The leader remains flawless, the follower takes the punishment, and the trap closes just a little bit tighter. So we've discussed the vulnerability of the recruit and the predatory nature of the leader, but how do the two connect? If a cult leader walked up to you on the street and said, "Hi, I want to drain your bank account. I want to alienate you from your family and dictate everything you wear," you'd probably just run away, which might not be a bad idea. Cults do not lead with control, they lead with affection. They use a highly calculated, overwhelming psychological tactic known as love bombing. Imagine you are in a transitional state that we talked about earlier. You're lonely, you're grieving, you're lost. You walk into a new group and suddenly you are the most important person in the room. 10 different people rush up to greet you. They tell you that how special your energy is. They praise your intelligence, they listen to your deepest fears and respond with intense manufactured empathy. To a brain that has been starved of connection, love bombing is a massive immediate hit of dopamine and oxytocin. It is a psychological drug, and the cult is providing the ultimate high. Love bombing isn't just about being friendly, it's about rapid artificial intimacy. The group is actively gathering intelligence on you. They figure out exactly what your unique emotional void is, and they instantly mold themselves to fit it perfectly. If you lacked a father figure, the leader steps in as the ultimate protective patriarch. If you lack purpose, they tell you that you are the chosen one destined to help them save the world. They mirror your desires so perfectly that you walk away thinking that I've known these people for 3 days and they understand me better than my family has in 30 years. This creates an intense, almost unbreakable trauma bond. You begin to associate the group entirely with feelings of absolute safety, unconditional love, and profound belonging. But love bombing is a trap, and the affection is entirely conditional. Once the leader knows you are hooked on the dopamine of their approval and the dynamic shifts, the overwhelming love and praise are suddenly pulled away. The leader becomes cold and distant or highly critical over a minor perceived infraction. Because your brain is now addicted to their validation, the sudden withdrawal creates panic. You'll do anything, absolutely anything, to get that warmth back. You'll work 80 hours a week for free. You'll recruit your friends. You will endure public humiliation, all because you are desperately chasing the high of that initial love bombing phase. By the time the recruit realizes the unconditional love was actually a highly conditional cage, the door's already closed and locked. The cult has become their sole source of emotional survival, leaving them perfectly primed for the next phase of recruitment. Milieu control and isolation. Once a recruit is thoroughly hooked on the affection of love bombing, the leader has to make sure that the group becomes the recruit's only source of truth. Now, to do this, they employ a tactic called milieu control. The term is coined by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton in his groundbreaking study on brainwashing and thought reform. Milieu simply means your environment and your surroundings. Milieu control is the systematic, absolute control over all information and communication coming into a person's life, as well as everything going out. If you want to control how a person thinks, you don't need to perform a magical mind control spell. You simply need to control the data that their brain is allowed to process. Milieu control begins by slowly severing the recruit's ties to the outside world. The leader will claim that the outside world is impure or toxic or unenlightened. They tell you the truth. They tell the recruit, your family doesn't understand your new path. If they question our methods, it's because they are being controlled by dark forces or because they secretly want you to fail. By demonizing outsiders, the leader ensures that when a concerned mother or a worried friend tries to intervene, the recruit doesn't hear love, they hear an attack. The cult member actively pushes their family away, isolating themselves precisely as the leader intended. Next, the cult restricts what the member is allowed to consume. Members are forbidden from reading outside news or watching certain movies or researching the group's history online. In many high control groups, reading critical articles about the leader is considered a severe spiritual offense. If you completely cut off a person's access to external journalism, dissenting opinions, and the grounding reality of their family and their world, it will shrink to the size of the cult. The leader's voice becomes the only voice they can hear. This creates a psychological echo chamber. When the leader tells them that the sky is red, the member looks around, and because every single person in their tightly controlled environment is nodding in agreement, the member just accepts that the sky must be red. Milieu control doesn't just isolate the body, it completely quarantines the mind. When I was in college, we had a different word for this, and it was called psychological incest. When no new information is allowed to come in, everything is controlled and tightly maintained. And so it's just this big echo chamber. We often think of cult manipulation as a pure psychological game, something that happens only through words, ideas, and emotional abuse. But the most effective cult leaders know a fundamental biological truth that if you want to break down a person's mind, you start breaking down their body. In psychology, the prefrontal cortex is the area of your brain responsible for critical thinking, complex decision making, and evaluating logic. It's the part of your brain that waves the red flag when something doesn't make sense. But the prefrontal cortex requires massive amounts of physical energy to function properly. When the body is exhausted, the brain naturally shuts down these high level critical thinking skills just to survive. Cult leaders exploit this biological vulnerability through a process called physiological weakening. Cults disguise physical exhaustion as spiritual and professional devotion. It rarely looks like outright torture at first. Instead, it's framed as necessary sacrifice for your own growth. One of the most common methods is sleep deprivation. In many high control groups, members are forced to attend mandatory lectures that go late into the night, only to be woken up at 4 a.m. for morning meditation or intense labor. A person running on 3 hours of sleep for months on end is physiologically incapable of defending themselves in a philosophical debate. They simply don't have the energy to fight back. Diet is another major tool. Many cults mandate extreme, highly restrictive diets. They frame it as purification or detox process, forcing members to fast for days or live on dangerously low calorie or low protein meals. When the brain is starved of essential nutrients, cognitive function plummets. A starving brain is a highly suggestible brain. And finally, cults keep their members in a state of perpetual frantic motion. Whether it's a religious group requiring 80 hours a week of unpaid manual labor on a compound, or a toxic corporate cult demanding endless hustle to prove your loyalty. The goal is the same. If a member is constantly exhausted, starving, and working, they never have a quiet moment to sit down and process their reality and ask themselves, hang on, does any of this actually make sense? Now, by maintaining this absolute physical exhaustion, the leader ensures that the recruit's critical thinking alarm system is permanently turned off. The recruit is kept in a constant state of foggy, compliant survival mode, perfectly primed for the heavy indoctrination of what is about to follow. So, how does a smart person justify doing terrible things? Now that their recruit is physically exhausted and isolated from the outside world, the cult leader begins the heavy lifting of true indoctrination. To understand a, how to get a fundamentally good person to do terrible things, we have to look at the famous psychological theory developed by Leon Festinger in the 1950s called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the intense psychological pain you feel when you hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time, or when your actions completely contradict your own morals. Imagine your core identity is I'm smart, I'm rational, and I'm a loving person. But then, because of a gradual boundary testing and manipulation we discussed earlier, you find yourself doing something entirely irrational, like handing your entire life savings over to a charismatic leader or cutting off contact with your broken-hearted mother. The brain looks at action A, I'm smart and I'm loving, and action B, I just abandoned my mother and my money, and it panics. These two realities can't exist in the same brain. The resulting psychological friction can be agonizing. The human brain absolutely hates the pain of cognitive dissonance. It will do extreme mental gymnastics to relieve the pressure and make the contradiction make sense. To resolve the pain, you only have two options. Option one, you admit that you were conned and that you made a catastrophic mistake and that you hurt your family for nothing. For the human ego, this realization is psychologically devastating. It is a total collapse of self-esteem. Now, option two, you change your core beliefs to justify your actions. You convince yourself that the action wasn't a mistake at all. It was necessary. It was a noble sacrifice. Cult leaders understand this psychological vulnerability perfectly. They intentionally engineer situations that force you to act against your own best interests, creating massive cognitive dissonance. Then, right when you are in the most mental pain, the leader will swoop in and offer you option two. They hand you the exact narrative you need to justify your actions and protect your ego. The leader tells you you didn't abandon your mother, you protected her from a spiritual truth that she isn't evolved enough to handle yet. Or you didn't throw away your life savings, you invested in the literal salvation of humanity. To your desperate, exhausted brain, this rationalization is a huge relief. You eagerly adopt the cult's extreme ideology because it's the only thing that makes your extreme actions make sense. This is one of the darkest ironies of cognitive dissonance. The more a person sacrifices for the group, the stronger their belief in the group has to become. If you just give $5 to a group, you can walk away easily. But if you've given them your marriage, your career, and your moral compass, the psychological cost of walking away is too high. You have to believe the leader is the Messiah because if they aren't, you've just destroyed your life for nothing. The cult uses your own internal desire for psychological consistency to cement the indoctrination. And then, and to make sure that you never question that indoctrination, they deploy a linguistic trap to shut down your critical thinking for good. Thought terminating cliches. As a recruit, tries to resolve their cognitive dissonance, they might still experience fleeting moments of doubt. They might see the leader act abusively or notice a glaring flaw in the organization's finances, and their exhausted brain attempts to ask logical questions. To prevent these questions from ever gaining traction, cults employ a linguistic weapon. They change the way the recruit is allowed to speak. In 1961, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton coined the term thought terminating cliches. These are short, highly reductive, catchy phrases that a group uses to instantly shut down cognitive dissonance and end any critical debate. They act as psychological stop signs. When you encounter a complex problem or an uncomfortable truth, you are trained to deploy one of these cliches, effectively paralyzing the analytical part of your brain. Every high control group has its own unique dictionary of thought terminating cliches. If a member of a doomsday cult asks why the leader is living in a massive mansion while everyone else is starving, the group will immediately respond with a cliche like, oh, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, or, well, we don't question the anointed. In a toxic MLM multi level marketing scheme, if a recruit points out that the math simply doesn't work and they're just losing money, their upline will deploy the cliche, you're just letting your limiting beliefs hold you back, or you have to ignore the haters and just trust the process. In modern political or internet based extremism, complex geopolitical debates are constantly shut down with phrases like fake news, sheeple, or do your own research. The terrifying genius of thought terminating cliches is that it feels like an answer, but it actually requires zero cognitive effort. It compresses the most complex, painful human problems into brief, highly absolute, and emotionally loaded catchphrases. When a cult member is trained to use these phrases, they no longer have to engage in the agonizing reality that they may be in a dangerous situation. If a family member calls crying, begging the recruit to come home, the recruit's brain automatically fires off the cliche, well, they're a suppressive person. They're just toxic to my vibration. The cliche immediately relieves the guilt and ends the internal conflict. Over time, the cult member's vocabulary shrinks. They lose the ability to articulate nuance, express genuine doubt, or communicate effectively with anyone outside the group. Because they can only think using the limited thought terminating vocabulary that the cult provides, they become they're completely mentally trapped. The leader doesn't need to physically lock the door. By controlling the language the recruit uses to think, the leader has built an inescapable prison out of words. And once the linguistic prison is built, the leader can deploy the ultimate trap to ensure that the recruit never leaves. phobia, indoctrination, and sunk cost fallacy. By this point in the process, the recruit is isolated, physically exhausted, relying entirely on the cult's language to process reality. But what happens if, despite all of this, the exhaustion simply becomes too much and the member decides they want to pack their bags and go home? Well, to prevent this, the cult leader must ensure that the outside world no longer looks like a sanctuary. It must look like a nightmare. This is achieved through psychological mechanism known as phobia indoctrination. When the recruitment phase relied on love bombing to draw the person in, the retention phase relies on absolute paralyzing terror to keep them there. Cult leaders do not just promise heaven inside the group, they actively threaten hell if you step outside of it. Phobia indoctrination is the systematic planting of irrational, catastrophic fears regarding what will happen to you if you defect. The leader consistently tells the group that the only place they are safe, physically, spiritually, or financially, is inside of the organization. If you leave the doomsday cult, the leader assures you that you will be destroyed in the impending apocalypse. If you leave the toxic wellness community, they convince you that your cancer will return or you will immediately regress into severe depression. If you leave the extreme corporate startup, you're told that you will be a lifelong failure who is incapable of succeeding in the real world. These aren't just casual warnings. These are repeated so intensely and so often that they become deeply embedded psychological triggers. The member is trained to associate the very thought of leaving with an immediate, visceral panic response. This tactic creates an invisible electric fence around the recruit's mind. The door to the compound might be wide open, but the psychological terror of walking through it is too overwhelming to bear. And this is why, when you see interviews with cult survivors, they often describe the feeling like a hostage who is terrified of being rescued. The leader has successfully convinced them that the abusive cage they're living in is the only safe place on earth, and that anyone trying to pull them out is actually trying to push them off a cliff. When you combine this intense manufactured phobia of the outside world with the devastating realization of how much time and money they have already lost to the group, you create the final inescapable psychological trap, the sunk cost fallacy. The deeper you go, the harder it is to leave. If you sacrificed your career, your marriage, and 10 years of your life for the group, walking away means admitting that you were conned. The human ego will go to extreme lengths, including staying in an abusive cult, just to avoid the psychological devastation of admitting that you were that wrong. Now, let's imagine that cult members they manage to bypass the exhaustion. They push through the thought terminating cliches and temporarily overcome the terrifying phobia indoctrination. Now, for a brief, lucid moment, they look around the compound or the toxic corporate office and they realize, hang on, this is a scam. I need to leave. But then their brain does this terrifying math of what walking away actually means. And this is where the final psychological lock snaps into place. It's a well documented cognitive bias known as the sunk cost fallacy. In everyday life, the sunk cost fallacy is the reason that you stay in a movie theater and watch a terrible movie simply because you already paid $20 for the ticket. Your brain tells you that if you walk out, you've wasted your money. So you stay and waste your time too. Now, multiply the $20 ticket by the entire human lifetime. When a person has been in a high control group for 5, 10, 20 years, their sunk costs are astronomical. They have given the leader their life savings. They've abandoned their career and they have missed the funerals of their parents because the cult told them not to attend. They have sacrificed their youth, their autonomy, their reputation. But if they walk out that door, they're not just walking into terrifying outside world, they're walking into a mirror. Leaving requires looking at their reflection and admitting a psychologically devastating truth. I was conned. I threw away my life for a lie. I hurt the people who loved me, and I have absolutely nothing left to show for it. For the human ego, that level of grief and humiliation is almost impossible to process. It's a total catastrophic collapse of self worth. Because the brain can't handle that level of devastation, it activates a defense mechanism. Instead of cutting their losses and walking away, the member doubles down on the delusion. The subconscious mind decides that it is actually less painful to stay in the abusive environment and hope that the leader's promises eventually come true than it is to leave and face the ruins of their life. If they just stay and work a little harder, pray a little more, or recruit a few more people, then maybe the utopia that the leader promised will finally arrive and all those agonizing sacrifices will be justified. The sunk cost fallacy ensures that the more the cult takes from you, the harder you will fight to stay. The sheer magnitude of your sacrifice becomes the very mortar that seals you inside of that prison. This is why extracting someone from a cult is so incredibly difficult. You're not just fighting the charismatic leader, you're fighting the victim's own desperate need to validate their lost years. So, how does anyone ever get out? How do you deprogram a mind that has been completely hijacked by this dark triad, isolated by milieu control and paralyzed by sunk cost? To conclude our anatomy of cult, we have to look at the psychology of the escape and how we can spot these high control tactics in our everyday lives. While phobia indoctrination keeps members terrified of leaving, and the sunk cost fallacy convinces them they've invested too much to quit, there's another vital pillar of control keeping the mental prison intact. The leader must meticulously dictate the information the recruit is allowed to consume. In classic cult psychology, this is often referred to as the milieu, but in the modern digitally connected area, it manifests as the creation of impenetrable information silos. If a leader wants to convince you that the sky is red, they can't allow you to look out every window or ask a meteorologist. They they must strictly curate every piece of data, news, and media that enters your brain. To build this silo today, a cult leader rarely needs to confiscate smartphones or cut phone lines or move everyone to a remote compound in the jungle. Instead, they use a psychological tactic known as poisoning the well. The leader systematically discredits every external source of information before the recruit even has a chance to look at it. Mainstream journalists are labeled as corrupt, brainwashed, or agents of the devil. Former members who speak out are preemptively branded as bitter, lying apostates who couldn't handle the truth. And family members raising concerns are dismissed as unenlightened or toxic suppressive persons. The recruit is conditioned to believe that the outside world is actively conspiring to feed them lies. Therefore, the only safe, pure, and accurate source of truth is the leader of the group's officially approved literature, videos, and podcasts. Once the well is successfully poisoned, the leader no longer has to enforce the information ban. The recruit voluntarily isolates themselves. They stop reading outside news. They refuse to listen to dissenting opinions. They block and unfollow anyone on social media who contradicts the group's dogma, entirely policing their own algorithm. They build walls of their own information silo. Inside this airtight echo chamber, the group's narrative goes completely unchallenged. Every success is attributed to the leader's infallible genius, and every failure is blamed on the evil outside world or the members' lack of faith. By entirely monopolizing the recruit's information diet, the cult leader successfully constructs an alternate reality where their voice is the only one that truly exists. When we hear the word cult, our mind instinctively conjures up images of isolated compounds in the desert, matching robes, bizarre doomsday prophecies. Ooh. Well, we naturally tell ourselves that we're far too smart to ever fall for something so obvious. But modern, high control groups rarely look like the tragic headline grabbing cults of the 1970s. Today, architecture of coercive control is frequently hiding in plain sight. It's cleverly dressed in the sleek, social, acceptable aesthetics of extreme corporate startups or MLMs or trillion-dollar wellness programs. In the corporate cult, the charismatic leader is repackaged as a visionary CEO, or a high octane entrepreneurial guru. The recruitment phase doesn't happen on a street corner. It happens during an intense, high energy job interview or an exclusive company retreat. Love bombing takes the form of endless office perks, explosive initial praise, and the intoxicating promise that you're part of an elite team that is about to change the world. Once you're hooked, the coercive tactics begin. If you complain about the grueling 80-hour work weeks or the leader's abusive outbursts, you're hit with a thought terminating cliches like you lack vision, you're not a team player. The ultimate red flag is the phrase, we aren't a company, we're a family, which is specifically designed to make setting normal professional boundaries feel like a devastating personal betrayal. The wellness and self help industries offer a different but equally dangerous disguise. Here's a charismatic leader, an influencer, a celebrity life coach, or an alternative health guru. Instead of promising salvation in the afterlife, they promise total physical purity, manifestation of wealth, and spiritual enlightenment in the present. To keep you dependent, these wellness cults rely heavily on information silos. They convince you that modern medicine is a toxic conspiracy, positioning the guru's expensive supplements or elite retreats as your only true path to healing. If their methods inevitably fail, the blame is turned back on the victim. Your vibes were too low, or you let your limiting beliefs manifest the disease. While modern cults often hide in corporate offices or wellness spaces, traditional religious and political cults remain deeply powerful by offering absolute certainty in a chaotic world. They leverage universal human desire for a higher purpose, framing their movement as the ultimate world defining battle between good and evil. By claiming exclusive access to divine truth and the only valid political framework, they systematically demand unquestioning loyalty from their followers. In religious, cult like groups, the charismatic leader typically positions themselves as a prophet, messiah, or sole conduit to God. Any natural questioning of the leader's actions is immediately reframed as severe spiritual failing or sin, which makes critical thinking feel inherently dangerous to the member's soul. This dynamic creates a dangerous environment where members will endure extreme financial or physical abuse, genuinely believing their suffering is a necessary test in order to gain eternal salvation. Political cults operate on the almost identical psychological frequency, simply replacing divine mandate with rigid ideological purity and utopian promises. Members are heavily conditioned to believe that their political opponents are not just incorrect, but are actively malicious enemies plotting to destroy the foundations of society. This absolute black and white, us versus them mentality effectively justifies crossing severe ethical boundaries, as any aggressive action is deemed acceptable if it serves the ultimate cause. Anybody notice that in any of the political parties? Whether the group ultimately gathers at a religious altar or a partisan political rally, the final goal of these cult like thoughts is total erasure of the individual identity. Personal beliefs, independent moral compasses, and outside relationships must be completely sacrificed to serve the group's supreme, unquestionable mission. Ultimately, the member ceases to exist as an independent thinker, functioning instead as a deeply programmed extension of the leader's will. The most terrifying aspect of the modern cult is that its members appear completely free. The prison is no longer constructed from barbed wire and armed guards or the physical isolation in a remote jungle compound. Instead, the bars of that cell are entirely invisible, woven directly from or directly into the fabric of the victim's daily digital life. Whether you are deeply entrenched in an extreme hustle culture, startup, or a toxic wellness community, the psychological hardware operating behind the scenes remains exactly the same. The leaders cleverly weaponize your own ambition and desire for community against you. They use relentless Slack notifications, mandatory late night Zoom calls, and exclusive group chats that maintain a state of constant surveillance and control. You are physically allowed to walk down the street, go to a bakery, get a donut, or call your family, but the deeply ingrained phobia indoctrination travels with you in your pocket. You police your own behavior and isolate yourself, terrified of being labeled toxic or failing to achieve the impossible perfection that the group demands. It's a brilliant, devastating trap, an inescapable psychological prison that the victim voluntarily logs into every single day. The journey out of the high control group rarely begins with a dramatic rescue. Rather, it usually starts with a tiny, agonizing crack in the leader's facade. A member might witness an act of cruelty that directly contradicts the group's supposed values, triggering a massive wave of cognitive dissonance and thought terminating cliches can no longer suppress. This singular moment of clarity allows the victim's suppressed critical thinking skills to temporarily reignite, giving them a brief window of courage needed to question their reality. Once the physical decision to walk away is made, the individual immediately slams into the terrifying wall of phobia indoctrination that they were conditioned to fear. They must survive intense psychological withdrawal symptoms, battling overwhelming panic attacks, deep isolation, and terrifying belief that they have just doomed themselves. Escaping requires the monumental mental endurance to push through this manufactured terror until the nervous system slowly realizes that the outside world can be safe. The final and longest stage of leaving is the profound grief and reconstruction of the self as the victim confronts the devastating reality of the sunk cost fallacy. They must painstakingly relearn how to make their own decisions, rebuild their entirely shattered vocabulary, and rediscover their authentic personality that the cult had tried so hard to erase. Ultimately, our ultimately recovery is a courageous act of reclaiming one's autonomy, proving that the human mind's innate desire for freedom is stronger than any psychological prison. The most glaring red flag in any organization is the charismatic leader who demands absolute obedience and aggressively evades all accountability. If the founder, the CEO, or your head guy, whoever that is entirely immune to criticism and structurally prevents any system of checks and balances, the foundation for a high control group is already firmly in place. In these environments, the leader's personal intuition or desires will always supersede written rules, ethical boundaries, or even basic logic. Healthy organizations and relationships welcome questions and debate and independent research as vital components of growth. In stark contrast, toxic groups instantly weaponize your curiosity, treating any critical inquiry as a personal betrayal, a lack of vision, or a spiritual failing. If your genuine concerns are consistently met with hostility or deflected using thought terminating cliches, you're dealing with a psychologically coercive environment. A safe community will actively encourage your relationships with people outside of the group, recognizing the inherent value of a diverse, independent support network. Cults, however, will systematically drive a wedge between you and your loved ones, isolating you to increase your dependency. They will carefully label anyone who expresses concern about your new lifestyle as a toxic influence, an unenlightened soul, an enemy to your mission, just to ensure that you stop listening to them. Finally, be intensely wary of any group that demands total uncompromising purity in your thoughts, diet, political alignment, or your daily schedule. Because human beings cannot maintain this artificial perfection. You will inevitably fail to meet those impossible standards. The group will deliberately exploit these failures, using manufactured guilt and shame to keep you trapped in a deeply profitable cycle of endless striving, financial dependency, and psychological control. Now, the most dangerous misconception about coercive control is the deeply ingrained belief that only naive or unintelligent people fall into these psychological traps. In reality, modern high control groups actively target individuals who are highly empathic, deeply ambitious, and searching for genuine purpose. Recognizing that every human possesses this fundamental vulnerability is the vital first step in dismantling the shame that keeps victims silent. Ultimately, our most effective defense against psychological manipulation is a relentless, unapologetic commitment to radical curiosity. These coercive systems thrive in the shadows, relying entirely on phobia indoctrination and information silos to quietly paralyze your analytical mind. By actively questioning absolute authority and fiercely protecting our personal boundaries, we successfully starve these toxic structures of the blind obedience that they desperately need in order to survive. The profound tragedy of a cult is its attempt to completely erase the person's identity, but the immense hope lies in the undeniable resilience of the human spirit. Survivors consistently prove that it is entirely possible to escape this invisible prison, to navigate the devastation of the sunk cost fallacy, and successfully rebuild a vibrant, independent life. As you navigate the complexities of the modern world, always trust your internal alarm systems. Fiercely protect your autonomy and never surrender your fundamental right to ask questions. You should be worried about anything that doesn't allow you to question. You should question everything. The ultimate antidote to coercive control is the simple, radical act of asking a question. No genuine truth is ever destroyed by honest scrutiny, and no healthy organization will ever punish you for wanting to understand it better. Keep your curiosity sharp. Refuse to accept those thought terminating cliches, and remember that your intellectual independence is one of your most valuable assets. As you navigate the complexity of modern workplaces, wellness spaces, and digital communities, always listen to that quietest voice of doubt. If an environment demands your total submission and requires you to abandon your personal moral boundaries, it is officially time to walk away. You always possess the inherent strength to set boundaries, to protect your mind, and firmly define your own reality. Thank you for joining me today on this deep dive into the invisible architecture of a coercive control and extreme group psychology. One last note, this doesn't have to be a group. I see the same kind of grooming done in relationships, one on one. Romantic relationships can use the same kind of manipulation and control. So, whether it's a big group or whether it's just in your relationship, if you see these signs, these behaviors, please ask yourself if you should be doing this. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay vigilant, deeply value your own autonomy, and never let anyone else do your thinking for you. Stay safe, stay curious, and take care of yourselves. I'll talk to you next week.